Let's sew the curves of the Stars Above quilt. If you've joined me for a quilt along in the past, you know that I believe that curves take practice and that every quilter will find a method that works for them when it comes to sewing curves. Some quilters use all the pins, some use none, some sew curves slow and steady, and some speed sew. Practice will show you what works best for you. In the meantime, if you are new-ish to curves, I'll show you how I prefer to sew them, and you can start there. I'm going to be sewing an example curve with the fan section of the block, and that looks like this. The fan section has multiple seams to watch for as you sew the curve, and I want you to see what that looks like. The blocks that include the fan section also require more accurate curve piecing. When we trim these blocks later, you'll see that there's a little bit of extra fabric built into the background template E-piece. However, we are going to be careful to trim the least amount of the star block as possible. So that means less accurate curve piecing may result in having to trim from the center of your block, this D or fan section of the block. If you're using the full template D piece here like this, it won't make any difference if you trim some of it because it's all one piece. However, if you're using the fan section for your block, if you trim from either side, it may make your fan wedges uneven. So although the quilt is full of movement, and I really don't think that'll be noticeable once your quilt is put together, we are going to try to make our curve piecing as accurate as possible at this stage. We are going to start with this smaller curve. Usually we start our curve sewing with a fold. If you are using a full D piece, then you line up your straight sides and you finger press to mark the center of the curve you're going to sew. With the fan section, if you've lined it up and trimmed with the center line, you know that this is your center point, and we know that the star's center is the star point. So we're going to place our star block and our fan section right sides together and line up those center seams, and I pin here. I only use a few pins when I'm sewing curves, but I like this center pin because it gives me a place to stop and realign my fabric halfway through the curve, and it also lets me know if my curve has been accurate up to this point. So if I don't have enough fabric to get here, or if I have extra by the time I get here, then I know that the first half of my curve probably wasn't sewn accurately. The other pins that are really important are at the beginning and the end of the curve. And at the end of the curve, you want to make sure that the straight side of your fan is lined up with the straight side of your star. If you keep these two edges lined up the entire time you're sewing your curve, your block will be more accurate. So I pin all the way across the edges so that that is not going to move. And then I do that again at the top of the curve or at the beginning of the curve. I line up my two straight edges. And I pin. Okay, at the sewing machine, I'm going to make sure that my straight edges are still lined up. And I'm going to take just a few stitches before I remove that pin. Okay, once I take out that pin, I'm going to line up my fabric along the edge of the curve. And here you can see how those seams are going to work with our curve. We've pressed the block so that the seams are going to be going in the same direction that we're sewing, but you're still going to need to watch to make sure that there's no separation at the seam, that these don't come apart and cause you to have more fabric in your fan than you do in your star curve. Okay, as we sew, we're also going to watch for bunching at the needle. This one is going to go under my needle in just a minute. This curve is fairly small, so you're going to have lots of extra fabric over here to the left, but we are concerned with the fabric that gathers or bunches at the needle, not with this over here. So if it is going to do that, you just lift your foot. You can move some of your fabric behind your needle. You can also just gently pull on your fabric, and that will help ease the bumps as well. Because of the seams, you're just going to want to be careful if you pull that you're not pulling stitches out or separating that seam there. Okay, so when I get to the center, I take out that pin, and then here's where I will align the rest of the fabric along the next half of the curve. And just keep watching for the bunches. You're going to want to leave this pin in at the holding these two edges as long as possible, and toward the end you may need to adjust your fabric a little bit more frequently. And we just want to make sure that as we finish sewing that these two fabrics stay lined up like this. And that's the first curve. The next curve will require a fold to mark the center. We're going to line up the two short straight sides of piece E and finger press to mark the center of the curve we're going to sew. And then if you had a full template D piece, you would line up your straight sides of the star and D section, and you would crease to mark the center of the curve. We're going to place our template E piece right sides together with our fan, and we are going to pin at the center. And again, at the end of the curve, we are going to make sure that the straight side of E lines up with the straight side of the fan. We're going to pin that one all the way across. And then again at the top of the curve, straight sides lined up. Okay, so we're going to sew our second curve of the stars above block. And like with the first, we're going to make sure that our straight edges are lined up at the beginning of our curve. And I'm going to take just a few stitches before I line up my fabric with the edge of the curve. This curve is going to feel a lot easier than the first one, and you're probably going to have less bunching. Again, at the center, I take out that pin and take that time to align my fabric with the second half of the curve. Toward the end of the curve, there's always a little bit more adjusting necessary. Just make sure that these two edges stay lined up as you finish sewing your curve. Here's the pressed stars above block. There is extra built into your template E so that if your block is a little bit wonky, you'll be able to square it up and make sure that they all finish, or they all end up unfinished at 9.5 by 9.5 inches. So we're going to line up our block, making sure that we are losing the least amount of this star as possible. and then we'll trim these inside edges first. Okay, and after we have those trimmed, then we're going to measure 9.5 inches either way to the outsides of the block and trim those. I wouldn't normally move that, but the camera's in the way. Okay, and there it is. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to message me to ask those.